us pray. O Lord, grant us a daily awareness of the precious gift of life which you have given us. As members of this legislative assembly, we dedicate our lives anew to the service of our province and our country. Amen.
Introduction of visitors. Presenting petitions.
Calgary Northwest, followed by Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to present a petition from the Calgary Coalition for Life with 13,400 signatures from throughout Alberta, praying that the Legislative Assembly of Alberta do everything in its power as administrators of federal law governing abortions to curtail this tragic waste of life.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to present a petition received in my constituency office last week, signed by 476 people in the Edmonton area protesting cutbacks to family and community support services. That's provincial funding, which provides funding for the West Jasper Place Neighbourhoods Association.
Reading and receiving petitions. Presenting reports by standing and special committees. Notices of motions. Introduction of bills.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill number 39, Appropriation Alberta Capital Fund Act 1987. This is a money bill. Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the contents of this bill, recommends the same to the Assembly.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved for first reading Bill number 39, Appropriation Alberta Capital Fund Act 1987. Those members wishing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill 39 being Appropriation Alberta Capital Fund Act 1987, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill number 40, Appropriation Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund Capital Projects Division Act 1987-88. This being a money bill, Her Honour, the Honourable the Lieutenant Governor, having been informed of the contents of this bill, recommends the same to the Assembly.
The Honourable Provincial Treasurer has moved first reading to Bill number 40, Appropriation Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund Capital Projects Division Act 1987-1988. Those members wishing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. So ordered.
Bill 40 being Appropriation Alberta Heritage Savings Trust Fund Capital Projects Division Act 1987-88, introduced by Honourable Mr. Johnston, is now read a first time.
Mr. Speaker, I request leave to introduce Bill 274, being School User Fees Elimination Act. This bill would amend several sections of the School Act to remove those sections would allow the imposition by a local board of user fees. For example, boards could no longer sell or rent instructional materials and supplies to pupils, nor could it charge tuition fees and transportation fees for children attending an early childhood services program.
The Honourable Member for Edmonton Avonmore has moved first reading to Bill 274, School User Fees Elimination Act. Those willing to give assent to first reading, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, please say no. Motion carries.
Bill 274 being School User Fees Elimination Act, introduced by Honourable Member Ms. Lang, is now read a first time. Tabling returns and reports.
Mr. Speaker, I have the honour of tabling with the Assembly the annual report of the Department of Hospitals and Medical Care for the year ended March 31st, 1986. Mr. Speaker, in addition to this report, there are two supplements to the report that deal with statistical information on the Alberta Healthcare Insurance Plan, firstly, which is available in my office, and secondly, with the Hospital Services Division, further report that will be available within a few weeks.
Introduce special guests.
The opposition, followed by Ponoka Rimby.
Speaker, I'd like to introduce to you and members of the Assembly some 26 grade 6 students from St. Basil's Elementary School in Edmonton, Norwood. They are attended by their teacher, Mrs. Teresa Oslashewski. I hope I'm saying that correctly. I think they're in the members' gallery. I can't see behind me, but they're supposed to be seated in the members' gallery. I'd ask them to stand and receive the traditional welcome of the Assembly.
Mr. Speaker, it is my pleasure today to introduce to you and through you to members of the Assembly 37 Sunshine Seniors from the Ponoka Rimby constituency. It is a pleasure to be able to host them during this Senior Citizens Week. Mr. Speaker, they are an important group in the Ponoka community, busy helping each other and contributing to community life. Mr. Speaker, they are seated in the members' gallery, and I ask that they now stand and receive the welcome of the Assembly.
Edmonton Meadowlark.
Mr. Speaker, I would like to introduce to you and to members of the legislature a number of people who are here in support of the West Jasper Place Neighborhood Association and who share with all signatories of the petition that I just presented the concern that cutbacks in funding will result in the closure of that important community service. I would ask that they rise as I announce their name. Jeanette Patterson, Helen Keith, Cheryl Urbach, Ralph Lebo, Lena Letendre, Eugene Hamill, John Lorenz, Ron Erbach, Jordan Owen, Gail Riley. Mr. Speaker, I would ask that the members of the legislature join me in recognizing these guests today.
Member for Grand Prairie.
Mr. Speaker, it's my pleasure today to introduce a former colleague and friend. Mr. Bill Pringle is an agriculture researcher of some international fame. While some scientific researchers, Mr. Speaker, go into politics, others go around the world and continue to solve the problems of feeding people. Mr. Pringle is currently on special assignment in Pakistan, and he's visiting us today in the public gallery. I'd ask him to rise and receive a warm welcome.
Mr. Speaker, it gives me pleasure today to introduce to you and to members of the Assembly 14 students from the grade 5 and grade 6 class at the Alex Taylor Community School located in the riding of Edmonton Highlands. They're accompanied today by teacher Alan Bell and by parent Mrs. Parkins. I'd ask that they rise and receive the traditional welcome of members of the Assembly.
Pleased today to introduce 46 students that I met with earlier from the Britannia Youngstown School who are representing social studies class of grade 9. They are accompanied today by 2 dedicated teachers, and I would ask that they rise and be welcomed by the Assembly.
Ministerial statements. Oral question period.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the first question to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, this morning officials of Husky Oil have announced that unfulfilled government commitments have forced them to abandon plans to construct a $1.3 billion upgrading plan for the heavy oil from the Lloydminster fields. The Premier is, of course, aware that the heavy oil sold for a fraction of its ultimate value in the absence of an upgrading facility, and in the future this will have a very negative impact on Alberta's economy. My question, in view of this information, has the Premier decided to meet with Husky Oil and the other 2 governments involved to determine if this project can be saved?
Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate, perhaps, that the Honourable Leader of the Opposition is not in receipt of the real information with regards to the Husky Oil Upgrader, and I would draw his attention to the release from the company rather than from somebody in the media, which contradicts press reports that is dropping its bi-provincial upgrader project. The true report is that one phase of pre-construction engineering is nearing completion now, on schedule, and engineering employees have been given notice of that timing.
Supplementary question, then. That's very well and dandy. We know the engineering study. Then, is the Premier saying then to this House now that that $1.3 billion project is going ahead? Is that what the Premier is telling us?
Mr. Speaker, my colleague, the Minister of Energy, may wish to deal in more detail with this, but certainly we've, as late as yesterday, discussed the upgrader with officials of Husky, and they are certainly proceeding, trying to establish with all three governments a means under which it will go ahead.
Well, supplementary question to whoever has the information, Mr. of Energy or the Premier. We've been told that this has been ongoing for a number of years. I want to know if there is any new commitment that this project is, in fact, going ahead. Is it yes or no? Either member.
Well, Mr. Speaker, Husky has had discussions with the federal government and the governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan. In fact, they presented a conceptual framework to the federal government or to the House of Commons Committee last December, and have had discussions, as I say, with ourselves in Saskatchewan with respect to the concept of a guaranteed price. And those discussions have essentially been concluded. And as a result of those discussions, we expect that Husky will be presenting us with a formal proposal very soon.
Well, very soon, Mr. Speaker. I wouldn't want to hold my breath on this by the rate that we've been going. But one of my understanding is the holdup, of course, is the federal government failing to fulfill their commitment. And could either the Premier or the Minister of Energy explain to us his understanding of why the federal government is not prepared to honor their previous commitment to this important upgrading facility? What is the holdup?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the commitments that were made last year were with respect to the pre-engineering work, some $90 million that were provided by the federal government, the two provincial governments involved, and Husky. And that engineering work, the design work, has been completed at the end of March. And in today's economic environment, where world oil prices had fallen substantially, now moved up into the $20 range, the economics of the project are such that we're looking at different options as to how it can proceed as quickly as possible. And one of the conceptual options that Husky has discussed with us and the federal government have been the option around a price guarantee. In a deregulated market environment, we have difficulties with that particular concept and are looking at other options as to how we might proceed.
Supplementary, Westlock Sturgeon.
Mr. Speaker, if I may go back to the original to the Premier, I can understand the government might be a little reluctant because some of these monopoly type things, the government can get pushed into a bit of a corner in the dealing. But in view of the fact that the government, Mr. Speaker, has put up a considerable amount of the money of the engineering and the specs, is the government considering opening it up so some other Canadian companies in Alberta can get at bidding to put an upgrader in case the Husky people, or in view of the fact that the Husky people may be getting cold feet?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the last part of the question was completely hypothetical and hardly fair, too, to a company who has been working very hard to build this project and has spent a great deal of money in trying to construct a project that will be helpful to Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Canada in the future. We're not considering dropping them, as the member is suggesting. I think that would be a completely incorrect way to handle ourselves.
To Littleball.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister of Energy, could the Minister indicate in terms of the consultations that are now going on in terms of the future of the Husky Upgrader project, whether the federal government is looking at the project as part of the Western Diversification Program or not?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that question would be more appropriately directed to the federal government as to what they are considering. Certainly, we feel that an upgrader proposal, the development of oil sands plants and of our heavy oils in this province would be appropriate projects to have in the Western Economic Strategy paper when it comes out. And we'll be making representation to the federal government to make sure that we have our input into what comes out in that paper.
Second main question, Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I'd like to direct the second question to the Provincial Treasurer. Mr. Speaker, in the last 7 annual reports, the Auditor General has noted that the government's financial statements do not properly account for the unfunded liability associated with government pension plans. The Auditor has also expressed their concern repeatedly that the government has failed to take steps to curb the growth in that unfunded liability. My question to the Treasurer, will the Treasurer advise whether the government has now decided to recognize its obligation with regards to pension funds and to make provision for this liability?
Mr. Speaker, I just lost the one operative word, but I will, I think I understand the question. First of all, Mr. Speaker, there is no doubt that that unfunded liability, as we have discussed on previous occasions in this House, is one which is of concern to the government. It is a liability which must be disclosed and has been formally disclosed in our financial positions and has been disclosed in a consistent way with other governments. That is to say, it's done by footnote. And many specialists consider the footnote approach to be, in fact, much more vivid way of displaying that liability. Mr. Speaker, we are now in the process of considering the policy questions which surround this unfunded liability, and I would expect that I'll be making some recommendations to my colleagues very soon to, in fact, provide a strategy for that, to deal with that problem.
Supplementary question flowing from the Treasurer's answers, and Mr. Speaker, will the Treasurer advise whether the Treasury Board or his department has prepared any studies on alternate methods of dealing with this unfunded liability?
Yes, Mr. Speaker.
Supplementary question then, would the Minister indicate one study that I understand from that they're looking at from a table of contents that clear that the government is looking at such things as excluding new members from government plans, increasing contribution rates, and reducing benefits. My question flowing from that, given the sensitive nature of these matters and dealing with probably well over 100,000 people, will the Treasurer not agree that the contents of this report should form the basis of consultation with affected parties now, not rather than after the decisions are made?
Speaker, I do agree with the member from Edmonton Norwood that in fact this is a sensitive issue and does affect the future of many people who have both served this government and have served in other administrative, other boards that pensions are under our administration. And we fully recognize that, Mr. Speaker, and we will in fact deal with on that basis. Now, if the member across the way has some recommendations for us, then he should probably put them forward. Or if he has a study which for some reason has been given to him, then that's fine. We have a clear area to debate upon. But what we can do, Mr. Speaker, at some point, if it is in fact appropriate, is to examine those possibilities, and I'd be more than willing to listen to any representations or new ideas that he could give to us.
Supplementary question, the key is not the new ideas. Perhaps they're looking at the right ideas. The point is that people want to be consulted before the decisions are made. This government has a track record of making the decisions and telling people how it's going to work.
That's right.
And my question to the Treasurer then, will the Treasurer assure the House that the government pension boards and the affected employee groups will be involved in the preparation of studies and recommendations on this matter prior to going to Cabinet, where the decision will be made?
Mr. Speaker, I think this government is always taking every opportunity possible to provide consultation. and I can describe to the Legislative Assembly those events which in fact have been direct consultation with the affected groups, including the broad-based citizen who have responded in a variety of ways to our initiatives. And that fact is clear, Mr. Speaker, and there's no reason that that should be, by the suggestion from the member from Norwood, changed or challenged. Mr. Speaker, we recognize the importance of pensions to these groups. I've had an opportunity to speak to their boards on several occasions. We're in the process now reviewing all possibilities, and if in fact these gentlemen across the way and ladies across the way are sincere, Mr. Speaker, about dealing with the problem, then they should allow us the time to do just that, as opposed to simply taking a negative view as they traditionally do.
Edmonton Meadowlark on the supplementary question.
Mr. Speaker, could the Treasurer please tell the Legislature whether he is aware or not that the Quebec Public Service Pension Fund is fully 85 to 90% funded, and how is it that they have managed their fund so much more successfully than this government has managed its public service pension fund?
Well, that is in fact inaccurate, Mr. Speaker, and I won't stand for that kind of misleading statement from that member, because of course that's all we get from him is misleading statements. Let me say, Mr. Speaker, that we could change that immediately if we wish to. We could do a variety of things which put that pension plan back into order, but they may not be acceptable to those people who are using the system, and that's, I think, the reasonable position taken from the member from Norwood. We have to be sensitive to what, in fact, is reasonable to those people who are the users of the group. And this government is, in fact, sensitive to those wishes at all times. Let's remember, Mr. Speaker, that this government put $1 billion into those pension plans to shore them up. That, Mr. Speaker, was an unmatched contribution from this government to the pension plans of this province to ensure that the benefits were there. And that's the kind of policies we will follow in this government, Mr. Speaker.
Leader of the Liberal Party.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to designate my question to the member for Edmonton of Gold Bar. Saved again.
Gentlemen.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question today is to the Premier. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Social Services in this government has stated that all parents can be good judges of quality childcare and has praised parents who recently inspected daycare centres. Well, those parents and children had a chance to reply to the government's challenge today by protesting at the legislature, and the story they told was one of hard-working people, people who are desperate to stay at work, who are trying to ensure that their children are properly cared for. I'd like to know from the Premier, Mr. Speaker, will the Premier accept the advice of parents and undertake today that allowances to daycare centres will not be cut?
Mr. Speaker, the whole area of daycare matters should be dealt with by the Minister of Social Services. I would just say, though, that part of the opening of the honourable member's question touched on a real fact of life, and that is the number one responsibility is with parents.
Mr. Speaker, to be sure it's with the Minister of Social Services, but this is everybody's business, and Mr. Premier, I expect you to be on top of it. The Premier and his Treasurer insist that cutbacks are not going to harm people services wherever they occur, and yet the evidence is quite to the contrary, especially in daycare. Does the Premier realize that daycare is not a welfare program, but is an investment, one that increases the tax base by putting and keeping thousands of parents into the workforce?
Could I just repeat what I said previously, Mr. Speaker? The number one responsibility for the care of children is the parents. However, in the daycare area where the government works with the parents, it's clear that Alberta is the only province that provides more daycare positions than slightly more than are actually demand for, and that in fact we have the best daycare system in Canada.
Mr. Speaker, it's clear the Premier wasn't there this morning or didn't hear what was being said this morning. Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Social Services has admitted that the presence of a license doesn't guarantee quality in care. Certainly it doesn't guarantee training standards, monitoring, accountability. What does the Premier believe that a license issued by his government should mean?
Mr. Speaker, again, a license is not the real key. The key is the responsibility of parents. enough inspectors or the government couldn't hire enough inspectors or get them around enough places to take the place of parents who have the number one responsibility.
Buyer beware.
Clearly, Mr. Speaker, God is watching us. She's been thinking about us for generations in this regard.
Cut under Legislative Assembly. Could we have the question, please?
Mr. Speaker, the Premier and his ministers love to recount the many ways they throw money at people services. The province lags behind all other provinces. There are your standards, Mr. Premier. Behind all other provinces in implementing daycare staff qualifications. Why is the Premier's government reluctant to upgrade staff standards, leaving Alberta at the worst level among all provinces?
Well, obviously, Mr. Speaker, that's not correct. But second, Mr. Speaker, I should reply that the minister has at least 5 times in the House already told the honourable member or her leader that the matter of the daycare standards for training are currently under review. But I come back to that as one portion of standards. And this government's commitment to daycare, the number of positions, and the total overall quality of daycare is the best in Canada.
I'm checking out another daycare, perhaps. Edmonton Calder.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 1977, this government recommended and accepted that a full-scale review of standards and regulations in daycare would take place every 5 years. Would the Premier direct his Minister of Social Services to undertake this immediately?
The Honourable Minister is and would report to the House when she's here, Mr. Speaker.
Member for Little Bow, followed by Red Deer South, followed by Edmonton Glengarry.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Minister of Economic Development. The Department of Regional Industrial Expansion has gone dry. I'd like to ask the Minister what adverse effect that is going to have on Alberta in terms of the cost-shared programs or programs now instituted in Alberta.
Mr. Speaker, at a recent federal provincial ministerial meeting in Whitehorse that I had indicated to member for Clover Bar I would be attending, that was held on May the 28th, one of the items that we discussed was the future of IRDP and the ERDA programs. This portion of the meeting was held during our private session during an extended lunch period, and the federal minister asked that we retain, all of the ministers retain the confidence of each other in the nature of those discussions. I think it would be, though appropriate, to advise the honourable member that the review that is going on of the dry department and the programs contained therein is an extensive and thorough one, and that the results of the review and the decision of the federal government should be made in due course.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary, my understanding is that the dry budget has been expended at this point. Could the minister indicate that whether Alberta has received a greater amount than 1.6%, which was their share in 1985, for the current year, in which we are in?
Mr. Speaker, we have a number of agreements with the federal government that total, I believe the total face value of the agreements is $169 million. We are in the process of negotiating other agreements that would add to that. The precise percentage of funds as a percentage of those transferred to the province I cannot advise the member other than to repeat the fact that the provincial government is not at all supportive of the IRDP portion of the federal DRY program, wherein the grants are tiered, and that was the substance of our discussion on the 28th in Whitehorse.
Mr. Speaker, supplementary to the Minister, could the Minister indicate whether the federal government has given indication to the Minister or the Alberta government that the formula for that IRDP will be changed and would become a different initiative, say under the Western Economic Diversification Initiative?
Mr. Speaker, the federal minister asked that all of the ministers who attended that meeting not communicate the nature of our discussions at the present time.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Could the Minister indicate when some information will be made public with regards to that matter? Is the deadline time the date of announcement of the Western Economic Diversification Program, or could it be earlier?
The Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs may have a better idea of any timing of federal government announcements, but I don't have any particular knowledge of when they might make announcements.
Calgary Mountain View.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister, a brief that was circulated to a House of Commons committee indicated that the Minister of Federal and Intergovernmental Affairs contacted his federal counterpart as early as April 10th regarding an apparent lack of commitment by the federal government to the ERDA process. I'd like to ask the Minister, given this lack of progress in these negotiations, is there any more that the Alberta members of Parliament could be doing to advance the Alberta government's case in this matter?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not clear as to how I might answer a question that is directed at the Alberta members of Parliament. I would add, though, Mr. Speaker, that we, through the Alberta government, have excellent relationships with the Alberta MPs, and they are well aware of the Alberta government view with respect to the DRY program.
The last question really was beyond the jurisdiction of that particular minister. Westlock Sturgeon.
Yeah, speaking, this is supplementary, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Agriculture, but it does govern the question of plans running dry. In view of the two plans that have run dry for the Minister of Economic Affairs, has the Minister checked recently with the federal government because of the mixed signals coming out of Ottawa as to whether or not they will proceed on funding a plan for Western Canadian farmers, in particular Alberta farmers, to the low prices? Have you checked with your Minister to find out whether that fund is drying up?
Mr. Speaker, we were notified in response to the Honourable Member for Westlock Sturgeon that it's business as usual now with the Department of Regional Economic Expansion, in that they have some newfound money that has been approved to them through Treasury Board at the federal level, and Mr. Cote dated a telegram to that extent to his regional officials here within the province of Alberta.
Member for Red Deer South, followed by Edmonton Glengarry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Hospitals and Medical Care and concerns the in vitro fertilization clinic at Calgary's Foothills Hospital. I understand that since April 1st of this year that the clinic has been operating on a cost recovery basis. That is, participants have been paying for the procedure themselves. Would the Minister advise the Assembly how this policy has affected the operation of the clinic, and specifically whether or not it has resulted in couples being turned away because of a long waiting list?
Mr. Speaker, my information is that the waiting list is shorter than it previously was when the program costs were being picked up by donations and by people donating their time to the program, but that there is still a waiting list for the program.
Supplementary, Mr. Speaker. Would the Minister advise the Assembly whether or not there are any funds available for couples who wish to try this method of conceiving a child, but who cannot afford to pay the cost, which I am advised is in the area of $4,000 per attempt, with up to 3 attempts required, could be as high as $12,000.
Mr. Speaker, there are no funds available from the Department of Hospitals and Medical Care.
Supplementary then, Mr. Speaker, to the Minister. Would the Minister advise the Assembly whether or not certain portions of the procedure which are now billed to participants are in fact insurable procedures, and if so, whether he would give consideration to covering them under the Alberta Health Care Insurance Plan so as to reduce the costs of the participants?
That would simply be a different method of funding from the same pot of money which doesn't exist.
Not batting a very good average this afternoon, Mr. Speaker. Final supplementary to the Minister. The federal government has recently announced that it will cover the cost of in vitro fertilization for Native couples in Manitoba. Will the Minister advise the House whether or not Native couples in Alberta will receive the same consideration if they aren't already covered?
Mr. Speaker, I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd be pleased to follow up by contacting the Federal Minister of Health and seeking information from him as to what the federal government is doing in this area.
Thank you. Supplementary, Edmonton Centre.
Mr. Speaker, is the minister therefore saying that if you are rich and infertile in the province of Alberta and can afford the $4,000 treatment, you can get it, but if you're poor and can't, then you can't get the treatment?
Mr. Speaker, we had developed in Calgary a in vitro fertilization clinic that had been funded up until the beginning of this calendar year by voluntary contributions and by people who were involved in the medical community contributing their time to it. The Department of Hospitals and Medical Care had never provided any funding to that program, and nothing has changed.
Member for Edmonton Glengarry, followed by the member for Calgary Mountain View, and then Calgary Buffalo.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. For the Attorney General, although Western Cooperative Fertilizers has publicly admitted responsibility for the March 29 gas leak, and there were numerous witnesses, the government seems incapable of bringing this matter to a satisfactory conclusion, as they've still not laid any charges. Since we have in this situation eyewitnesses, admission of culpability, and the results of air monitoring, what more could the Attorney General possibly require in order to press charges?
Mr. Speaker, I've answered similar questions in the past. The evidence relative to this matter is now being thoroughly reviewed in order to consider whether or not a charge would be successful. Until such time as that has been done, Mr. Speaker, I would suggest that it is not appropriate to press on with repetitions of the same question in the Assembly. They are seeking a legal opinion on the matter.
No, we're seeking charges and wonder how many more things are going to be reviewed until after session, so there won't be as much publicity.
Honourable member, you've just asked a supplementary question. Minister? Well, he asked it as a question. Then pay. Okay. No, it wasn't.
I said we are wondering to continue the question. The Attorney General indicated on May 21 that he had received additional information from the Environment Department. Was this the point in time when he finally received the names of 2 previously ignored witnesses, or did he receive those names earlier or later?
Mr. Speaker, I'm not prepared to go any further in this matter in terms of answering questions of that nature.
Arrogance here. The hell with the environment, eh? No, it doesn't surprise. The government's historically dismal record of enforcing pollution laws indicates that something is wrong with the system. Can the Attorney General assure us that the problem here is not foot-dragging or the withholding of information by the Environment Department?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable member will just have to await the proper determination of whether or not, in the event charges would be laid, there could be a successful conclusion of those charges. And that is now being reviewed. It would be entirely inappropriate for me to get involved in the details of the case at this stage, and I don't intend to do that. but I can assure members of the Assembly that when the final determination by the agents of the Attorney General have been concluded, an announcement will be made.
Yes, it will come eventually, I suppose. On a more general vein, then, based upon this unfortunate situation, will the Attorney General be formulating a set of guidelines that will outline what kind of information is needed to successfully prosecute a pollution offence, and will he make that set of guidelines available to the Minister of the Environment so he can revise his monitoring policies?
Mr. Speaker, there are several acts of the legislature which outline the guidelines, and if the honourable member wishes to review them, he's certainly capable of doing so.
Westlock Sturgeon, supplementary question.
Mr. Speaker, in view of the fact that statute of limitations took care of a problem we had in some people and problems with securities here a year or so ago, can the Minister inform us when the statute of limitations will put an end to this? What date are we looking at before he has to move, or if it's too late?
The honourable member has a copy of the Act. He can check it himself.
Great. Calgary Mountain View, followed by Calgary Buffalo, Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My question is to the Minister of Recreation and Parks. This minister has stated his department's intention to divest or close 23 provincial recreation areas, reduce staffing, turn over operations of selected parks to private companies, in addition to camping fee hikes this year and others next year. Will the minister now confirm to the Assembly that these new policies are reducing the use and enjoyment of these recreation areas?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it would be very difficult to determine and answer unequivocally that there has been a reduction in services, not in services and use, because we're really only in about the third major weekend in the park season. At this point, I'd say that we're doing very, very well, and some parks have noted high increases for this time of year in view of the weather. So I'm certainly pleased to advise the Assembly there's no such matters occurring.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I've received complaints about poor supervision and rowdyism. Firewood has not been available and facilities are dirty or poorly maintained from all over Alberta. Will the minister outline what steps he's taking?
I got the boards over there going.
Will the minister outline what steps he's taking to correct these problems so that we can assure Albertans and visitors to Alberta that their camping experiences here are going to be good ones?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I think that's very interesting. The honourable member would refer to examples and not be specific. I would welcome that be presented to me at any time so that we can investigate and deal with them accordingly. The Rangers have all the authority to deal with specific complaints as they would arise in the individual parks, specifically as they relate to rowdiness or inappropriate dealing with the clientele in the parks, because of course this disturbs users. That's a concern that we have. I would hope that he would bring those instances to us so that we'd be able to follow up on them. As far as the overall parks where there's concern that he's outlined with regards to firewood and other instances, I would love to hear from them. I can't deal with them if I don't know where they're not being referred to.
That's right.
Mr. Speaker, the minister is removing even further his department's direct supervision of parks by turning some of them over to the private sector. What specific actions will the minister take when he receives complaints about the operations of these parks? At what point would he be prepared to cancel those leases?
Well, Mr. Speaker, it's a very interesting one, and one that should be clarified for the members of the Assembly. At this point, it really is hypothetical, but should it occur, I personally would be pleased to investigate them. I will be going out with the MLAs into the individual areas. There are 2 parks concerned. I've had the opportunity of meeting with the individuals who are operating those parks on a one-to-one basis. I believe, in all fairness to those individual operators, they should have an opportunity to prove themselves, and until that's proven not to be, I think they should have that opportunity, as I said, to try and maintain that service.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the minister, if a staff person in his department doesn't perform, can be fired. How will the minister go about, in view of the leases that he signed, quotes, firing those companies if they don't perform properly? He can do it with his staff people. How will he do it with companies that are taking over the operation of these parks?
Well, Mr. Speaker, we've maintained and said many times in this Assembly that as stewards of the resource we'll accept that responsibility, and to this day we'll accept that responsibility. If the parks are not being handled properly and the services are not being provided, we will deal with it. But until such time as we're provided that information, we will not be able to take any such action.
David Warner, followed by Westlock Sturgeon.
Supplementary to the Minister, Mr. Speaker, what steps is the Minister taking to encourage volunteer organizations to assume responsibilities for recreation areas across the province?
Well, I appreciate the question from the honourable member, and in reference to the 23 areas, recreation areas that we're endeavouring to divest, we have some 17 volunteer groups and community service-orientated agencies that have volunteered to undertake responsibility of these areas. We've yet to finalize all of them, and I will be reporting to the Assembly and all honourable members of those exact findings when they have been completed.
Westlock Sturgeon.
Speaker, supplementary to the Honourable Minister, in granting a license to these organizations to run the government or the taxpayer-owned camping grounds, what regulations or what processes are there in place that they have to measure up to in operating the grounds? Or is it like our daycare centers, buyer beware, camper beware, parents beware, whatever it is?
Well, Mr. Speaker, that's interesting because a lot like our daycare, there are standards, good standards in place. We have a criteria and a checklist that we've gone over with the people who are the operators, and we'll endeavor to maintain those standards. In particular, there were 6 individuals that met with the proprietors as well to ascertain their eligibility, and we'll ensure that these standards that we have in place will be maintained and followed. And I'd welcome the opportunity to go over with them with the individual member at any time. It was all through a public proposal, and there is nothing to hide, and the information is readily available at any time.
Calgary Buffalo, followed by Edmonton Strathcona.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. To the Minister of Education, social workers in Calgary have been saying that 25 to 33% of children arrive at school without an adequate breakfast or lunch. In 1985, 73,000 children in Calgary and Edmonton under 16 were living below the poverty line, and the hunger problem is clearly province-wide and has been getting worse as the economic problems have intensified. Would the minister please give this House a report about what she knows by way of surveys of principals, students, or otherwise about hunger in our schools, and what her department is actually doing about this province-wide problem?
Mr. Speaker, I too read with interest and concern the reports of recent days with respect to hunger directly focused on children. I think that all members in this Assembly, and in fact all Albertans and perhaps all of society, have a very grave concern about the thought of hungry children. I think government, however, has a role to provide a safety net, which we are doing and will continue to do. And with respect to the role of the Department of Education, I think with respect to this specific problem, that our role is to ensure that young people know what is nutrition and how to best spend what resources they have to ensure that they are well nourished.
No programs and no information. Why is it that everywhere we turn in the school system, whether it be sex education, user fees for students, multicultural education, and now food programs, we find a total absence of leadership by the Minister of Education in these issues, and indeed an almost total lack of information about what is going on in the system?
Mr. Speaker, I do not believe, as I think the honourable member does, that the education system can meet every single social, religious, physical, need of every single child. I think there are certainly responsibilities on the part of the education system which we are addressing. There are also responsibilities on behalf of society and on behalf of people involved within a particular program. It is not all resting on government. I disagree with them fundamentally on that point.
It sounds like the minister is taking a total hands-off position on this, Mr. Speaker. Will the minister, in fact, add this to her list of many undertakings that she has provided for review and reporting to the legislature? And in particular, will she take this up with the Minister of Manpower in order to see whether he might be able to spring some of the lottery money he has been hoarding in order to relieve the hunger of children in our schools?
Answer the first part of the question, but not the second, courtesy of the member's own document to the courts.
Well, Mr. Speaker, as I have said, I believe there is a role for the Department of Education specifically, and we are certainly addressing that role. The Calgary School Board, which the honourable member certainly represents the municipality from whom that board is speaking, has said that they are going to address the issue within their schools. One of the trustees from that board has raised the issue. They are going to be looking at it and addressing it as a community need and a community problem. I look forward to receiving any research which comes out of that study within that school jurisdiction.
Mr. Speaker, to the Premier, the Department of Agriculture's Nutrition at School program, which provided morning snacks for students, has been discontinued. Will the Premier tell this House whether he considers hunger amongst school children to be an important enough issue to warrant an undertaking that he will have his government review and coordinate an all-out attack on this problem, including provision of lottery funds if funding is a problem?
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker, I just say that the Honourable Minister of Education has dealt with the matter already.
Avonmore. Edmonton Avonmore.
Mr. Speaker, to the Minister of Education, young people need more than information on nutrition. What representation will the minister make to the Minister of Social Services to ensure that no children will attend school hungry?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I believe that there are, as I have said, many responsibilities on the part of many parts of government. It is not simply a matter of the Minister of Social Services, for whom I am acting today, and the Minister of Education to make such a decision. The decision is one of providing a safety net, which government can and should provide, and which government does provide in this province. I believe that the problem is one that communities need to address. I think government has a role in that, but government cannot be all and everything for this problem.
Edmonton Strathcona.
Mr. Speaker, my question is to the Attorney General and concerns the Maintenance Orders Enforcement Program. The last annual report of his department said that they expected that the number of files registered by the 31st of March of this year would be 10,000. In fact, the number was and remains about 14,000, of which some 4,000 are badly behind in enforcement and even registration. And what plans has the Attorney General in mind to increase staff to cope with this, or otherwise to cope with the arrears?
Mr. Speaker, the Maintenance Enforcement Program is an ambitious undertaking. It is a leading program in Canada of its nature, and we are doing our best to cope with that matter, and we'll continue to do so with the staff available.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is a good program. There's no doubt of that, and is perhaps in part the victim of its own success. But we learn that some 30% of the registrants have been unable to get off social assistance because of the arrears collected and the enforcement of the maintenance orders. And so it does appear to be paying its way. And I wonder in that case whether the Attorney General would not agree that the plan should be exempt from the hiring freeze in point of its staff.
Mr. Speaker, that, as I indicated during the course of earlier remarks and in my remarks and my estimates, we regard this as a high priority. And I don't have the exact numbers of people who are actively involved in the program at my fingertips. But my recollection was that in that particular area there was no diminution in the number of people involved in that. However, there were no additions either. And that is something that will be considered in terms of the operation of the program, which has really only been operating now for just over a year. And we would like to encourage people to participate in that program. Obviously, it is of concern. There were a number of points actually raised in the honourable member's question relative to people not being able to get off social assistance and so on. Of course, that depends to a considerable extent upon the amount of the maintenance awarded, and then, of course, as the ability to pay is a factor that has to be taken into consideration as well.
Time for question, honourable member. Time for question period has expired. However, might we have unanimous consent to continue this series of questions? Opposed? Edmonton Strathcona.
I was, in fact, remarking on the quite high percentage of people who had been enabled to get off social assistance, Mr. Speaker. But as the Attorney General remarks, it's been in force for over a year, just 16 months, I think, now. And having regard to that, what weaknesses, if any, has the Minister identified in the legislation?
Mr. Speaker, that is a matter, of course, that I will be reviewing with the Department as we approach the preparation of the budget submissions for the 1988-89 budget year. Certainly in my just over a year experience as Attorney General, I believe that this program has indicated a good measure of success, and I appreciate the clarification the honourable member made as to its effectiveness in terms of assisting parents and their children to no longer require social assistance. It obviously needs improvement. I think I said so during the course of my remarks and estimates, and I will certainly continue to keep that as a high priority as we commence the consideration of budget matters for the ensuing year.
Final supplementary, Mr. Speaker. When a payer who is paying complains that the payee is not honouring an access order, access to children, there are difficulties here, as the Attorney General, I'm sure, is aware. Will the Attorney General undertake at least to instruct that the complaint is passed on to the payee?
Well, the honourable members raised a very important point that has been raised with me on a number of occasions by persons who are paying. At the present time, of course, there is no way that the program enforces the question of access, and that is something we will have to review. The issue of passing on to the recipient is certainly something that we could consider, but it would only be, as the honourable member's question would suggest, a voluntary indication of concern. It's not a matter that we could, however, enforce under the current legislation. But it is a matter of concern to me and, of course, to many parents who are denied access to their children, and quite improperly so in many cases.
Time for question period. Supplementary. Time for question period has expired. Point of order.
Yes, I have a point of order, Mr. Speaker, with respect to your ruling that the portion of the question which I asked of the Minister of Education relating to the potential use of lottery funds to feed hungry children was in order, and you ruled, Mr. Speaker, that that was not in order, and I would like to point out that the last time that the issue of lottery funds was raised was on Friday, May the 22nd, subsequent to discussions we had had, an argument made with respect to the propriety of asking questions, and by precedent which was established on that day in which I was allowed to ask questions, and I refer to the questions that I asked to the Minister of Career Development, Manpower and Career Development, whether the government is now prepared to allow some of the lottery funds to be used to fund some public education programs. Question aloud. Is the minister, second question, is the minister telling this House that there's going to be no funding out of lottery funds for education, for creating jobs, for the handicapped, for social services, unless decisions are made by existing beneficiary organizations to make those expenditures? So my argument in respect of that is that the precedent and practice of this House, the most recent one, was that questions of that nature, which are not centrally related to the lawsuit per se, are allowable. Now, that is the precedent. The precedent, I would submit, is based on arguments that I made to yourself, Mr. Speaker, based on paragraph G of Section 23 of the standing orders, which seem to clearly indicate that if, at most, that this could preclude, this order would preclude questions directly relating to litigation. And the example that I gave in argument, and I would give again, is that a question I asked 3 weeks ago with respect to whether or not the government would bring in some form of measures to halt the use of knives in violent incidents, that question could be ruled out of order on the basis that there are constantly criminal cases in progress with respect to knivings. So it makes no sense, and by analogy, if your ruling precludes this question, then any general related topic would be precluded. Similarly, any constitutional issue in which is before the courts, and the distribution of spending authority between the federal and the provincial governments is now being litigated in Ontario between, pardon me? It's by analogy, though. Every argument and every argument has to relate to analogy, and you have to say, if this is right in case X, what happens in case Y? And it's known as reductio ad absurdum. And I would say we reach, if this pertains, we reach an absurd ultimate conclusion, and it should not stand. I would submit, Mr. Speaker, that your precedent of May the 22nd was the appropriate conclusion for those questions, although I might note that I still have reservations and would be prepared to argue once again even the issue of whether or not commentary on the lawsuit per se would be appropriate. But this is not the lawsuit per se. This is the subject matter of lottery expenditure of lottery monies. And a decision to preclude those questions would preclude questions with respect to any subject matter if there happened to be peripheral litigation relating to that.
Thank you, Honourable Member. However, there was another aspect which perhaps you overlooked, and it was the fact that it was a supplementary question, and there were indeed two questions being asked in a single supplementary. And so under Beauchene 371, that's where indeed the chair, to read through it, it's this matter that the extent to which supplementary questions may be asked is in the discretion of the Speaker. And because of a growing practice in this House of having 2 and 3 supplementary questions being rolled together in supplementaries, that also was the main reason why the chair intervened at that time and instructed the minister to answer the first question rather than the second. And sorry, the chair has responded. If you have a new point of order, it can't be the same one.
New point of order relating to the same issue, and that
this is, I'm sorry, Honourable Member, this is not University Mock Parliament. This is the real place. Orders of the day.